We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the center of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 5th of May 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, a jubilant Anthony Albanese and his Labour Party win a landslide victory in the Australian elections.
To serve our Australian values, we must value every Australian, and Labor will govern for every Australian.
We'll have the reaction to a vote which was as much about rejecting Trumpism as it was about domestic politics. Also ahead, in the next 60 minutes, we continue the theme of how the world navigates the influence of the US president as Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney heads to Washington. Plus, in Romania, the rerunning of the presidential election hands victory to a far-right ultra-nationalist. And we'll go through the papers, find out why the Americans are on the hunt to recruit new spies in China, and hear about a new overnight rail service connecting Switzerland to Denmark. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. The US President Donald Trump has announced 100% tariffs on foreign-made films. Houthi rebels in Yemen have vowed to launch more attacks on Israeli airports following plans by Israel to expand its military operation in Gaza. And Japan says it has no intention of using its $1 trillion plus holdings of US Treasury bonds as leverage in talks with Washington on trade. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, Australia's Labour Party is celebrating victory in this weekend's general election, winning easily enough votes to form a majority government. The incumbent Prime Minister Anthony Albanese told supporters that, and I quote, "with optimism and determination and faith in each other, we return to the work of building Australia's future." The opposition Liberal National Coalition's Peter Dutton, however, lost his own seat. I'm joined now from Brisbane by Paul Osborne, journalist and broadcaster from regular Monocle Radio voice here. A very warm welcome back to Monocle Radio. Good afternoon, Paul.
Hello. Good afternoon from Australia, where we are still slightly in shock at the scale of Labour's victory.
This was not just a majority; this was an increased majority. There's a sense of surprise, but also relief, one would imagine.
It's an extraordinary result, and certainly not one that the vast majority of pollsters were predicting. Labour took power in the last election in 2022 with a majority of just one. They had 77 MPs out of the then 151 in the House of Representatives. That number's dropped to 150 this time. But from pretty early on after the polls closed, it became obvious that Labour was making huge gains, not just in the cities. Every state there was a swing to Labour. The Liberal Party was suffering losses in every part of the country. And it became fairly obvious fairly early that not only were Labour going to win, but they were going to win a really significant victory. And although there are still some seats being counted at the moment, Labour have 85 of the 150 seats to the coalition of the Liberal and National parties, 39. It's quite likely that when all that counting's finished, Labour will have well over 90 seats. So going from a majority of just one in the last Parliament to probably a majority somewhere in the low 30s.
What's happened here? Has it been a resounding victory for the Labour Party, or did the opposition fail?
Well, Labour went into this election with voters telling pollsters they were unimpressed with the way the government had handled the economy. They were particularly unimpressed with the way they'd responded to the same cost of living pressures that electorates all over the world are demanding action from their politicians. And specifically in terms of Anthony Albanese, he really did seem to lose his mojo about 18 months ago when the voice referendum on the idea of an Indigenous voice to Parliament, amending the Constitution to impose that voice to Parliament body, failed in spectacular fashion. And it really did seem to dent his confidence. It also dented Labour politically. The coalition of the Liberals and Nationals went ahead of them in the polls. Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, went ahead of Mr. Albanese as preferred Prime Minister, and it stayed that way right through until February this year when the coalition was still ahead in those polls. But the moment the campaign began, things started to change. Anthony Albanese says he loves campaigning. He loves getting out into the streets and actually fighting for votes. And he did. He discovered a different side to him. He got his mojo back a bit. And at the same time, what we saw of Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, was that he's just not very good on the streets as a campaigner. He's just not very good at delivering those messages. Added to the fact that the Liberal platform was really pretty thin, to be honest with you. It's centred on building a wave of nuclear power stations, which there seemed to be very little public support for. And then beyond that, it involved things like cutting petrol prices temporarily, but it also had some very unpopular policies with voters. They wanted to end working from home and bring everyone back into the office. And they also wanted to charge people, cancel 2 tax cuts, which the Labour government had promised in the next 2 years. They had to reverse the work from home ban because it was so unpopular. It had to be reversed mid-campaign. They were planning to sack more than 40,000 public sector workers. That was so unpopular that they had to reverse course on that. And in the final days of the campaign, the wheels really did start to fall off the Liberal campaign very badly. They were struggling to stick to their messages. They were reverting back to culture war issues, particularly on issues around Indigenous rights. And they just seemed to be flailing around in the last few days. And the polls did start to shift to show that Labour was going from potentially getting a minority government to potentially a majority. But as I say, no polls predicted that Labour would finish up with a majority of around 30. Now, we haven't seen this size of majority in the Australian federal parliament in close to 2 decades.
Last week in Canada, we saw an unpopular incumbent government return to power in the face of tariffs from Donald Trump. How much has Donald Trump and his influence touched this election in Australia, where arguably the same things just happened?
Trump was a key issue in this election, just as he was in Canada, though perhaps not to the same extent or the same sense of immediacy of the danger. Obviously, Donald Trump has talked about wanting to make Canada America's 51st state. He has been more aggressive about tariffs than he was with Australia. But Peter Dutton very much had adopted as opposition leader a hardline persona, and there have been parallels with Donald Trump all the way through this campaign. Indeed, online detractors had taken to calling Peter Dutton the Temu Trump, referring to the Chinese online store, sort of a cut-price photocopy of Donald Trump. One of Dutton's closest supporters in one campaign event started talking about the need to make Australia great again. And they had to deny that this was the MAGA campaign of Australia. One of the issues you bump up against is that Australia has compulsory preferential voting. Everyone has to vote, and everyone has to rank every candidate on their ballot paper. And it means that there's no real benefit in appealing specifically to a hard right base, because it's not about mobilizing one group of voters over another. On some level, you have to appeal to all voters. So as the message got harder, as the message got more Trumpian, a lot of middle ground voters, the very voters that any party that aspires to government in Australia has to win round, those voters start to drift away. And we've seen in the swings in every state in Australia that a really significant proportion of those middle ground voters have decided, even though they weren't terribly impressed with Anthony Albanese's handling of the economy, even though they weren't terribly impressed with the government over the last 3 years, that they would rather give them another go than take a punt on someone who had styled themselves to some extent on Donald Trump and on his policies.
Is this a significant moment in Australian politics, not just because of the size of the majority that Labour enjoyed, but because it, for the first time in a very long time, stops instability within Australian politics? Because Albanese isn't he the first Prime Minister to serve 2 consecutive terms in more than 2 decades?
He is the first Australian Prime Minister to win back-to-back elections since John Howard managed it in 2004. He is the first Labour Prime Minister to be re-elected with an increased majority since Federation, which created the state of Australia as we know it back in 1901. I mean, it is a properly historic election, but what underpins it is this slow reduction in the significance or the dominance of the 2 main parties in Australian politics. 50 years ago, 95% of primary votes in Australian federal elections went either to Labour or to the Liberal National parties. Now, on Saturday, that was down to 67%. Now, the Green Party has been a significant force in Australian politics for several decades. But 3 years ago, at the last election, we saw the rise of these teal independents. They were people who really were liberal, but they were economically conservative, but socially progressive. And they were unhappy by the antagonism the Liberal Party was showing on climate change, on issues relating to Indigenous rights, and other issues too. Now, those Teals took a lot of seats off the coalition last time, and they had no chance of taking them back this time because they had leaned into those hard right talking points. In addition, there are now 2 parties of the hard and far right, which between them won about 8% of the primary votes this time. There are fewer safe seats for either party than there were in the past. There are many more seats where those independents and those smaller parties are vital, particularly where they choose to direct voters' preferences for when they get knocked out. And one other thing that's perhaps worth considering, this was the first Australian federal election where Gen Z and millennial voters outnumbered baby boomers. There were 7.7 to 6 million of the Gen Z millennial voters in the majority. Now, the fact that there are more younger voters doesn't necessarily signal a massive earthquake in voting, but we have seen studies showing younger voters are far less loyal, not just to the political right, but to traditional parties. And they're also far more savvy in a system like Australia's about working out how to use those preferences, ranking each candidate from 1 through 5, 6, or 7, to shift their support to get the result they want. So the lesson, although Labour has won a massive, massive majority in this election, it's still only won just over 1/3 of the primary votes. And so it's much like the election in the UK last year, where Labour won a huge majority on 1/3 of the votes. It's a big majority in Parliament, but it's quite a shallow win among the public. So that vast win that Anthony Albanese will continue to celebrate this week, could very easily be snatched away when Australians go back to the polls in 3 years' time.
Finally, Paul, we need to touch briefly on the international element of this. Australia is seeing a big moment in rearming. If you're sitting in Washington, what are you thinking? And how does Australia now retain its position or grow its position within the likes of Five Eyes and AUKUS?
Well, you mentioned the Donald Trump factor, and one of the questions that came up in the last of the TV debates between Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton was this question of, did Mr. Albanese have Donald Trump's mobile phone number? And there has been this big thing. Peter Dutton was taunting him, saying, you can't get a meeting with Trump. You can't even get a phone call with Trump. Anthony Albanese's had a news conference in the last couple of hours where he has said he's spoken with Donald Trump today. It's a conversation that he said was warm, though he didn't give any efforts on any issues, particularly around tariffs. And he's also confirmed that he'll be in Canada next month for the G7 meeting in Alberta. Now, in theory, you could tag on a trip to Washington, D.C. there. And so I'm sure they'll be very keen to get over to Washington and to start building a better relationship with the Trump White House. But there has been talk about increasing Australia's defense spending, just as there is in Europe about increasing defense spending, both as a show to the United States that countries are willing to pull their weight, and also just that sense that maybe Australia can't hitch its wagon to the US and assume that America will always come to its aid. You mentioned AUKUS and Five Eyes. AUKUS, of course, the big nuclear submarine treaty signed with the US and the UK. And the Five Eyes alliance, absolutely vital. These 5 nations of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, and the United States, who share pretty much every bit of intelligence. Australia is a key partner of the United States and other major Western powers. But like all the other partners, it is still at the moment wrestling with exactly what Donald Trump in the White House means for those alliances that they have perhaps taken for granted over the last few decades. It will now be for Australia's re-elected Prime Minister to try and fight Australia's corner, though he may get a chance to do that when he heads over to North America next month.
Paul Osborne in Brisbane, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. This is The Globalist. 7:15 a.m. here in London, 2:15 a.m. in Washington, D.C. Now, Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, has said that he travels to Washington this week with what he says is the expectation of difficult but constructive conversations with President Donald Trump. The two men had a phone call at the end of last week, but this face-to-face encounter will be crucial in establishing the direction of relations between the two countries in the light of what could be a very nasty trade war. Paul Waldy is Europe correspondent at the Globe and Mail. He joins me once again on Monocle Radio. Good morning, Paul.
Hi there.
So this is what? Difficult but constructive conversations. What do we take that to mean?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think the emphasis should be on the word difficult because, Carney goes into these discussions tomorrow without really knowing what he's up against. I mean, Canada really has no idea what Trump wants. I mean, he's talked about annexing Canada. He mentioned it again on Sunday in an interview that the border was artificial and that the U.S. doesn't need anything from Canada. So it's pretty hard to negotiate a trade treaty with somebody who says we don't really need any of your products and you have no leverage. So I think Carney at this point is probably just trying to feel Trump out and establish some kind of rapport.
And in terms of the rapport, there is a pattern now that we generally see. Donald Trump always needs to demonstrate that he has won, whatever the battle. He has fired salvos at Canada when it comes to tariffs. Mark Carney, a seasoned negotiator, a seasoned crisis manager, not a politician. So we have two non-politicians talking to each other. How will Carney manage Trump?
Well, he was asked that on Friday at a press conference because, of course, Trump is now, he likes to have these kind of settings where these leaders come in and they sit down and then the reporters ask a bunch of questions and it goes on forever. And we've seen a lot of drama come out of those things. And, Carney was asked how he's going to handle that. And he said, well, preparation. So I don't really know what that means, but I think he's probably thinking long and hard about how he's going to approach that, what he's going to say or not say, and what his whole demeanor will be with Trump. Because I think, in the past, Trump has mocked Justin Trudeau, the previous prime minister, called him the governor. He hasn't done that yet with Carney. I think he sees Carney as a different, probably more sophisticated, more business savvy animal. So he may take a different tack with Carney. At least I think that's what Carney's hoping for. But we have to see whether that, translates into any real results.
And can Carney stop the tariffs, which are already having a devastating effect on the Canadian economy?
Well, and that's the key. And he was asked that again on Friday. Will you ask for the tariffs to be removed before talking about a trade agreement? And that's what a lot of Canadians want. He didn't answer that question directly. The only thing he has said really is that two things. One, he wants to impress upon Trump, which makes a lot of sense, that Canada is the U.S.'s biggest client in a way. I mean, yes, Canada's biggest trade partner is the U.S., but the U.S.'s biggest trade partner is Canada. So there has to be some recognition of that. And also, he does want a three-way agreement, much like Canada, U.S., and Mexico have already had, twice, in fact. He wants that to be part of the discussions, not just a bilateral agreement. He really wants Mexico in there as well. And that's interesting because, of course, last fall, Canada was prepared to go it alone with the U.S. So a little bit of change in tack there from the Canadian side. But again, they just go into this meeting not having a clue as to what Trump actually wants from Canada.
What we are seeing, though, is these proposed tariffs are already damaging the economic relationship between the two countries, because we saw General Motors last week cutting production in Ontario. 2,000 jobs are going.
Absolutely. And that's what's going to happen going forward. It's Canada that's going to feel the effect of these more than the U.S. Yes, the U.S. will feel some effect and feel more of the effect of global tariffs that they put on other countries. But Canada feels a real direct impact. And you mentioned, GM announcing layoffs on Friday and last week, 2,000 jobs. There'll be more expected, not just in the auto industry. Of course, Canada is facing huge tariffs on steel and aluminum and tariffs on a lot of other products, too. So there is a real immediate impact. And that's why there's a lot of pressure on Carney to get these tariffs dropped before he starts talking about a bigger trade agreement.
How much pressure is there on Mark Carney to think long-term strategically and to pivot Canada away from excessive reliance on what is now becoming a very unreliable neighbour?
He's talked a lot about that, and I think there's two things that he and previous prime ministers have talked about forever, but that for now, right now anyway, because of the circumstance, might actually happen. One is to broaden Canada's trade horizons beyond the U.S. I mean, we are dependent on the U.S. for 70-80% of our trade. There's a free trade agreement with Europe that most businesses don't even know exists. So I think he wants to really start diversifying that trade. And the other big issue in Canada is breaking down barriers between the provinces. The 10 provinces often act as little fiefdoms, keeping out other provinces' products and that. And really, Canada has to get around that and move beyond that. And I think there finally is a real motive and incentive amongst the provincial premiers to actually do that. So that may be a bit of a silver lining for Canada that finally might get its own house in order. And Carney has talked about that. But again, even with that, that takes a long time. And the immediate impact of the tariffs from the U.S. is very direct.
Paul Waldie, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come in the programme, we get a roundup of what's making headlines in the Balkans. Stay with us on The Globalist.
Craft is a matter of perspective, a unique outlook, an obsessive attention to detail. With UBS House View, you get the big picture in bite-sized articles, delivered daily and curated by over 200 globally connected, locally active analysts, all focused on identifying the latest investment opportunities and market risks to help you achieve your financial goals. UBS, banking is our craft.
7:21 here in London. Let's continue with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio, Terry Stiasny, political journalist and author of Believable Lies. Welcome, Terry.
Good morning.
How's life?
It's very well, yeah. So, as you just said there, I've got a new book coming out in June, which is very exciting.
Do we have a publication date?
We have a publication date, 12th of June. It's a book about, well, something we'll come on to. It's about fake news, essentially, but it's a historical book set during World War II. I mean, it's an actual book of history with footnotes and everything. And it's about the people who created deliberate radio propaganda that was broadcasting into occupied Europe and included a hefty dollop of fake news to try and lower enemy morale.
Would I dare to suggest that the re-election of Donald Trump might actually be quite good at boosting your sales?
It might, yes, possibly. It made it certainly more topical than it might have been.
Goodness me, doing well. Well done. Thank you for that, and we look forward to it. And I'm sure we will have you back to talk about it. Terry, in the meantime, what have you spotted in the papers? There's a good article in The Guardian, isn't there, about France and Europe in particular, well, France in particular, and the European Union, wanting to lure American-based scientists to Europe.
Yes, this is really interesting. I mean, we'll see a couple of things. Obviously, everybody is responding to, whatever Donald Trump's latest policies or changes, and France and the EU, in particular, Emmanuel Macron and Ursula von der Leyen, are making a very big concerted effort to try to attract scientists who are currently based in the States, whether American or from elsewhere, to come and work in France and elsewhere in Europe. And to that end, they're making some big speeches at the Sorbonne with European university leaders, with researchers, where they're suggesting that there could be incentives and protections for scientists to come and work in Europe. And the way the Élysée put it in this Guardian article is saying, we are a space where there's freedom of research and no taboo topics. They're particularly interested in scientists who are working on health, infectious diseases, climate research and artificial intelligence. And they are other countries as well, France, Germany and Spain as well, are trying to suggest to the European Commission that this is really a sort of profitable area for them, and they really should try and be persuading more researchers to come to Europe.
Which is an absolute masterstroke by the French, who are always very good at doing this kind of thing. But this article actually highlights the fact that this is easier said than done, because investment in the United States in research has far outstripped that of parts of Europe. And although there are fears that areas which are not approved of by the Trump administration could find themselves starved, there is nonetheless a bit of an uphill struggle here for researchers and scientists who wish to maintain that level of investment.
Yes, I think so. I think in the level of research, I mean, obviously, it would be interesting to know what the kind of difference is that you could expect in terms of, the facilities, the actual, your ability to do your work in Europe compared with the US. And also, one of the issues here that they point out is the salaries. An academic researcher in the US, it says here, is paid more than their French equivalent. The trade unions have been saying, well, you're going to need to offer better salaries and better funding if you're going to attract these scientists. But also they're hoping that they're saying, you're probably going to have to pay more tax, but they're hoping the pay gap would narrow and saying, well, you won't have to pay as much for your education or your healthcare and you'll get more social benefits if you come to France, but you probably might not earn as much money.
You might get a better lunch as well. Right. So one of the stories that's been breaking in the last few hours is another Donald Trump tariff bombshell. This one is on the movie industry.
Yes, this seems to be, Donald Trump seems to have spent his Sunday evening looking at things going on in California. One of the things he was talking about is he wants to reopen Alcatraz, the famous prison on the island. And the other thing is that he wants to impose 100% tariffs on, in his words, all movies produced in foreign lands, because he believes there's been a very fast death of Hollywood. He is also saying that this is a concerted attempt by other countries to try and sort of take American movies, which he says is a national security threat and is also messaging and propaganda on behalf of the foreign countries. And so he's saying that there should be 100% tariff on foreign movies. But of course, the question is, how on earth do you actually enforce this? And how do you count it? What counts as an American movie? I mean, particularly in this country, in the UK, we've got huge amounts of studio work is built on doing lots of special effects or doing some filming for bits of American movies. I mean, you walk around London any day and you will see bits of American movies being filmed here or elsewhere in the world. Does that count as an American film, or does it not count as an American film if only part of it is made elsewhere? I think this is one of these things, this is a Trump pronouncement. You have to see if it comes into force or how on earth it is workable.
Let us enjoy, this is the only way to describe this, is this attempt by Vladimir Putin to become accessible and to become and to show his life behind the scenes. And if I were a manufacturer of kefir, I'd be pretty worried.
Yes, this is Vladimir Putin's own, I suppose propaganda is probably the best word for it. He has made a documentary commemorating his 25 years in power, and he's showing people around his apartment, which I've got to say has got, it looks a little bit like some of the decor in the White House. There's a lot of gold going on. There's a sort of a white grand piano, and he's showing off his kitchen. He's showing off his £200 Australian-made blender, according to the Daily Telegraph, a £400 Turkish coffee maker, chocolates, and attributing his good health, I think, partly to his drinking of kefir. Yeah, and he's showing off his gym as well. And obviously, the point of this is for him to say, I am still, fit and healthy. He is also more seriously and worryingly talking about, he's saying, I hope there's no need to use nuclear weapons in the future, and actually sort of raising the question of his succession. Very vaguely, he said there should be a person or several people so that the people have a choice as to who his eventual successor could be.
This is absolutely worth watching, given the fact that he's trying to open up and be normal, and yet the items and the lifestyle that he has is more akin to a sort of a Californian health guru than a Russian president.
Well, yeah, I think, and if you're a Russian watching this and you're probably, suffering economically, the fact that he's got, these very expensive, gym and these very expensive kitchen appliances and all sorts of luxury, do you admire that, or do you just think, hang on, how is he getting all of this and keeping all of this for himself?
The opposite to this is Emmanuel Macron doing something quite astonishing. He's going to local cafes and bars across France, apart from the fact that in order to not necessarily chime with the people, he's arriving in helicopters.
Yeah, no, it's come a very different way, obviously, for a democratic president to approach being a man of the people. And actually, it has to be said, Macron is usually quite good at actually chatting and engaging with people when you see him in public, but he obviously doesn't get to do that very much. And the Times describes what happened in Chaumont, a town of 22,000 people, when suddenly, as you say, they heard a helicopter landing in the local sports stadium, and the people in the bar, which is called the Quatre Fesses. I'm not sure that the press officer,
bottoms.
the Four Bottoms, chose the title of this bar particularly well there. And then these people suddenly looked around and said, "Oh, look, there's the president of France standing next to me." One man said, "At first, I didn't believe it was him, as he ordered a coffee for himself, a pastis for one of the guests, drinks for everybody else who wanted them, and then spent 40 minutes talking to the customers in the bar, talking about pensions, talking about the cost of living." And apparently he has done this like half a dozen times since the start of the year. And so, it's just, he occasionally will get his helicopter and might be turning up in your bar, in your French town.
For a man who has the reputation of being Jupiter, aloof, different, distanced from the populace, from citizens, and who cannot serve a further term, one wonders if he's like come to this party a little bit late.
Yes, possibly. I mean, yes, if you can't run for re-election. But I think it's probably quite a good idea. I mean, as long as you don't suddenly discover, that how much he's spending on it. I think that might be the question that people might want to know. But, he seems to have got on pretty well, certainly with one of the people. He took photos. He had good discussions with people who said they didn't want to vote for him. And so, maybe it's a good idea. Maybe more politicians should do this.
Terry Stiasny, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. The time here in London is 7:30 a.m. A look now at the latest headlines. The US President Donald Trump has announced 100% tariffs on foreign-made movies. He complained that the American film industry is dying a very fast death because of incentives that other countries were offering to lure filmmakers. Houthi rebels in Yemen have vowed to launch more attacks on Israeli airports, following plans by Israel to expand its military operations in Gaza. The group said it would work to impose a comprehensive air blockade in Israel and warned airlines to cancel flights to Israeli airports. A missile fired by the Houthis hit the outer edge of Ben Gurion Airport on Sunday. And Japan says it has no intention of using its $1 trillion plus holdings of US Treasury bonds as leverage in trade talks with Washington. Japan is the largest foreign holder of US government debt. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now let's have a look at some of the other stories we're following today. Monocle's fashion director, Natalie Theodosi, now tells us about the shortcomings of the fashion industry and what's next for the sector. Let's hear her essay, here voiced by Monocle's Grace Charlton.
Claudio Morenzi, president of Italian luxury brand Erno, travelled to London last week to host a conversation at the Italian embassy and discuss the enduring strength of Italy's fashion and manufacturing sectors. Morenzi has been behind the transformation of the Erno business from manufacturer to fashion label, best known for material innovation and high-performance outerwear. He takes the long view when it comes to the hurdles the luxury industry is currently facing, saying tariffs aren't new and that luxury fashion will be among the least affected sectors. For Morenzi, the slowdown in the luxury market has more to do with big groups focusing too much on the balance sheet and getting carried away with high pricing without adding value for the customer. He cited consumers no longer finding a balance between price and value and that higher price points usually cover the costs of new shop openings and over-the-top events. As such, he warned that this is when spending money to dress yourself is no longer fashionable, and it becomes an ethical rather than a financial issue. His advice for fellow fashion entrepreneurs: keep your margins between a healthy 15 to 25%, avoid the temptation to inflate them to 35% like some luxury houses have done, and return the focus to artisanal quality and the human touch.
And my thanks to Grace Charlton for that, and indeed to Natalie Theodosi. For more from Monocle's editors and correspondents, sign up for our free daily newsletter. The Monocle Minute can be found at monocle.com/minute. Now, a far-right nationalist Eurosceptic who wants to cut aid to Ukraine and calls himself Donald Trump's national ally is on course to win the first round of the Romanian presidential elections. George Simeon is claiming victory in this weekend's vote, a rerun after the first round was annulled on the grounds of Russian interference. Well, to bring us up to date, I'm joined now by Alison Mutler, who's a journalist in Bucharest, manager of the Universal Net news site, and has been monitoring events for us for the last few days. A very warm welcome back to Monocle Radio, Alison.
Good morning.
We have a convincing victory for a far-right candidate, George Simeon, here, don't we?
We have Mr. Simeon clearly won the first round. It was a protest vote. There are a lot of Anglos were furious about the cancelled elections. They've had their say, and 40% of Romanians, or 40% of voters, have cast their ballot for Mr. Simeon, who, as you said, wants to halt military aid to Ukraine and is very critical of EU leadership.
Now, the background to this, if we can briefly touch it, is that the previous election was declared null and void because of Russian interference. And at that point, a far-right candidate came from nowhere and then won. We now have a far-right candidate ostensibly winning fair and square. So what's happened in between?
I think the vote that we saw for Mr. Simeon is actually anger at the cancellation of elections and anger at the government. Voters are sick and tired of the government, the mainstream political parties, and have voted against them. They're also aligning themselves with the far right, with the MAGA movement, with Donald Trump, with other far right movements, with Viktor Orban, with Slovakia, other countries where there's a far right. But a lot of it is anger with Romania's government, as well as the current political trend, the global political trend.
Now, we now have a surprise as well. Not just we have George Simeon, who looks on course, but this now goes to a runoff, doesn't it? Now, up until not very long ago, a few hours ago, it looked like the runoff was going to be against a pro-European former senator, Crin Antonescu, who was polling above 20%. That's now changed, hasn't it? Because we have the mayor of Bucharest now making a very big gain.
The mayor of Bucharest, who is an independent, he's a centrist, he's a pro-European, scored perhaps a surprise victory over Crin Antonescu, who had all the support of the government and all the logistics of the government behind him. This shows that Romanians they are voting against the government. They do not want mainstream candidates. And so George Simeon, as he positions himself to the runoff, he can't say he's running against the system or the government because he's actually running against he's not an independent. So in a way, this weakens one of his arguments because we now have in the runoff two candidates who have nothing to do with the Romanian government. We've
seen in the last few weeks, and we've mentioned it today on the Globalists, the fact that Canada and the Australians very much voted for a centrist, stable, anti-Trump narrative and government in order just to keep a lid on things. Romania seems to be splitting in two extreme directions now, and that is deeply divisive for the country, isn't it?
It is. Romania is now going to choose which path it takes. Will it stay a committed member of NATO and the European Union, or will it choose another path and align with more disruptive, shall we say, policies such as Trump, align with Hungary, with Slovakia, with perhaps Meloni? It's an existential choice, people are saying in Bucharest, between the East and the West.
And indeed, I mean, what is likely to happen here if Simeon gets into power? Because he is then able to nominate a prime minister, isn't he?
On paper, he isn't, but in reality, he will, because if he does win the runoff, and that is not a given, he will have a lot of informal power. We will see MPs, lawmakers, defect from the mainstream parties to the right-wing camp. And behind the scenes, he will be able to maneuver and get a government, maybe not immediately, but he'll be able to get a government which is more in line with him politically.
Alison Mutler, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio.
There's a craft to every question, which is why at UBS, we query every aspect of the market, working with specialised experts and award-winning research teams, covering over 3,500 stocks in 50 countries, all delivered in a comprehensive library, answering what you want with what you need. UBS. Banking is our craft.
14:39 in Beijing, 8:39 a.m. in Zurich. Now, the recruiting of spies is conventionally seen as a rather cloak and dagger affair. Now, however, the US intelligence agency, the CIA, has taken a slightly more direct route by using YouTube. The agency has published 2 videos in Mandarin to sow uncertainty among Chinese citizens and to try to recruit more agents in China. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by David Schlesinger, who's an independent advisor and commentator on media, journalism and indeed China. Welcome back, David. Good to see you. Good morning. This is brazen.
Is it brazen or is it desperate? I think the background is that for the last 25 years, the U.S. has had failure after failure after failure in China. In 2001, a U.S. spy plane crashed in Hainan. It collided with a Chinese fighter jet. The Chinese eventually gave it back, but only after disassembling it. And they gave back parts, bit by bit, because they understood everything. Then the U.S. tried to bug the Chinese new presidential airplane, but the Chinese discovered all the bugs and were able to disassemble them and figure out all the bugs. And then from 2010 to 2020, the Chinese took apart human networks in China and executed up to 30 American spies. So I think what happened is that this Trump put pressure on the CIA. The CIA gathered their bureaucrats in the room. Everybody sat around nervous. And finally, some bright spark said, I know, we'll make a film. And that's what they did.
What's in the video?
They're nice videos. I mean, they're very well produced, beautiful, excellent Chinese. The first one that I saw shows some secretary, I guess, a number 2 aide to his boss, watching his boss in the limo, watching his boss eating Peking duck in a fancy restaurant, watching his boss doing very well. Then he goes home to his mother in a small, dingy apartment, and the voiceover says, why does everyone else get all the riches? You can be rich too. Help us out if you're in the CIA. The second one shows an official or someone who looks like an official sitting at a banquet table waiting for his guests to arrive. And then it's clear that the guests have been nabbed by the Chinese secret police and it's just not safe. And the voiceover says, we can protect your family. Help us. And then on this video, they put up the CIA's darknet Tor address, send us your secrets. Now, it seems to me this is just a beautiful opportunity for China to absolutely send this deluge of false information, red herrings, leads, all of which have to be followed up. And maybe there might be 1 or 2 disaffected officials who might reveal a secret or might want to sign up. But there'll be this thousands upon thousands of false leads.
Which partly answers my next question. Is this thing going to work?
Look, I think it's clear that the U.S. wants to understand China, but it's also clear the U.S. doesn't understand China. I'm an old man now. I've been doing this for 40 years or something, and I've met a handful of U.S. officials who spoke beautiful Chinese and understand China really, really well, but only a handful or maybe a handful and a half. So it's one thing to get information. It's another thing to understand information. It's really difficult. That's number one. Number 2, China is a place that controls information very, very tightly. Whether you're a journalist or whether you're a spy or whether you're a diplomat, actually finding someone who truly knows something is hard work.
Indeed. I mean, one wonders how difficult it is, in fact, to be a spy in China, given that traditional culture of surveillance now.
Well, I think the risk and reward profile is a dangerous one. As I said, China does execute people for spying, and the rewards might be a little bit of money. There's a promise from the Trump administration that you get a visa or your family would get a visa. I mean, who's going to believe that promise in the current environment?
So you mean can get out as well?
Yes, exactly.
What do you think Beijing is going to do, not just in response at taking an extra special look at those people who are accessing the YouTube videos via a VPN, but is Beijing now going to respond with an active recruitment drive of Americans in America?
Look, everybody spies on everybody else, and we've certainly seen, even here in the UK, that China has tried to infiltrate Parliament in various ways. That's part of the game. If I were a betting man, I'd put my money on China to be able to do a more successful job. The Chinese the level of English in China is far better than the level of Chinese anywhere in the West. The level of understanding is there. And what Trump has also done in just a few hundred days is he's really galvanized nationalist sentiment within China. So I think there's a new wave of people who would like to protect the country and like to actually build up the country. I think the U.S. will have a hard time. I think China will have an easier time.
And as a result, I mean, how imbalanced, if so, do you think that the sort of the spying relationship will be between China and America? And we began this conversation by you saying, well, absolutely best of luck to them, because the Chinese seem to very good at catching people and machines that are used.
Well, I think what we learned from the Edward Snowden revelations of a few years ago is that the U.S. probably does have a real edge when it comes to eavesdropping and doing that kind of electronic surveillance. So I would not be surprised if the National Security Agency, the NSA in the U.S., has a really good tap into a lot of Chinese information. The question is, can they analyze it properly?
Why is that?
Just the level of Chinese skills and the level of analytical skills. It's a narrow group of people who can do it. And quite honestly, if you go to a law firm or a company, you can triple or quadruple your government salary in an instant. Not necessarily in journalism, but in law or business, it's the rewards are much greater. So yes, there are some patriots who are true believers who might stay in the CIA, stay in the NSA to help, but are they the ones with the best Chinese and the best analytical skills? Some, yes, not all.
David Schlesinger, thank you as ever for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist. Time now for the headlines from the Balkans. Guy Delaunay is Monocle's Balkans correspondent. Good morning, Guy. How are things where you are?
Do you know, they're a bit rainy, Emma. It's a bit grim. I've been for a bike ride this morning and it was getting a bit moist. So I think a little bit of sunshine will be welcome, but we're not going to get it.
Glad to have you dried off. Tell us, after your bike ride, did you have time to sit down and find out what's going on in the world where you are?
I did indeed. And the thing that's really going on at the moment is everybody's scratching their heads and trying to work out exactly what's going on with Serbia's President Aleksandar Vučić. And the reason for this is that he was in the US last week and he'd been saying he was going to be there for a few days and he'd be meeting Donald Trump at least once. And then he came home suddenly without having met President Trump at all. And this was apparently due to a health problem. He suddenly fell ill, was what his office said. But of course, people are wondering whether this was a diplomatic illness, and for two reasons. One, whether the meeting with Mr. Trump wasn't as firmly scheduled as Mr. Vučić had been painting it out to be. And two, at the end of this week, Mr. Vučić is scheduled to go to Moscow to attend the military parade hosted by Vladimir Putin, and he'd been warned by the European Union that would be a very bad idea for Serbia's EU accession talks. So is this a diplomatic illness on two fronts? Of course, the opposition are having a field day, and everybody else is just trying to work out what's going on, or whether Mr. Vučić is actually ill.
The poor man can't even be sick without people speculating that his of major geopolitical schisms. But how much does this actually genuinely reflect the difficulty that Vučić finds himself in?
Well, this is the eternal tightrope which Aleksandar Vučić has been walking, and he's been walking it since 2012, when his Progressive Party first came to power in Serbia. Back then, he was officially deputy prime minister, although everybody knew he was really in charge. Since then, he's been prime minister and now president. And the way I put it is, he knows which side his bread's buttered, but he doesn't want it to land jammy-sign down on the carpet when he drops it. And that's the problem that he's got. He's always trying to maintain these strong relations with Russia. Because that appeals to, first of all, it appeals to a certain element of his support base, the sort of conservative Serbs who like this idea that there's an Orthodox brotherhood with their fellow Slavs in Russia, and that Russia somehow is the great supporter of Serbia, even though it never really has been. That's the myth they like to believe in their hearts. So there's that element to it. But there's also the element that he wants to keep the European Union honest, to say, look, we've got alternatives. If you're not going to be serious about Serbia joining the European Union, we've got other friends we can turn to. So, and I don't really blame him for doing that, because the European Union has been extremely flaky towards the countries of the Western Balkans. I mean, it said it would have accession of all those countries back in 2003, made a declaration in Thessaloniki, said, yes, we want the Western Balkans in the European Union. Well, only Croatia's made it in since then. And it's notable that the European Union hasn't tried very hard to change that. So maintaining these dual relations, if you like, has been the tightrope act that Mr. Vučić has been walking. At the same time, I think he was hoping for rather better from the Trump administration in the US. He was hoping that he would get strong support from them over issues such as Kosovo. And it doesn't look like that's been happening. Maybe Mr. Trump is busy with other things, shall we say.
Let's move on to a story which is absolutely exhausting to read, let alone try to actually be part of, which is the Kosovan attempt to create a government. I think if you just look at a local paper, a national paper, the Kohar, it says, today is the 11th attempt to constitute the Assembly of Kosovo. Deputies are expected to gather at 10 a.m. Two lines of pure fact seem to look as if people all gives the impression that people are already on their knees.
Yes, I think they are to a degree. And this is bearing in mind that we had the elections in Kosovo in February. So in some respects, officially, we haven't actually had a government in Kosovo for the last 3 months. And they keep trying to constitute the assembly. So this means they want to elect a parliamentary speaker. And that's the first step to the formation and approval of a government by the members of parliament. They're not getting that because the person who's got the right to nominate the parliamentary speaker is the acting Prime Minister, Albin Kurti, whose party, Vetëvendosje, is the largest in the National Assembly. The rest of the parties can actually outvote him, and they have done on 10 previous occasions. He's put up a candidate, and they've said, no, we're not having that. And this is the issue that you've got. Vetëvendosje is the largest party, but they need to form a coalition if they're going to govern this time round. They're not willing to do that. The other parties aren't willing to do that. So we've got a stalemate. And, people are wondering what's going to happen. Is somebody going to blink? Is somebody going to compromise? Are the opposition parties going to get a turn at trying to put aside their considerable differences and form a grand coalition of their own? Or are we going to go back and have an election? And what happens then? I mean, the people of Kosovo put in their votes. They got the parties elected in the proportions that they voted for them. And yet these parties haven't got their act together to form a government which is, in some ways representative of what the electors of Kosovo have said they wanted.
Finally, Guy, a brief celebration of the trolley bus, something which I know that you enjoy.
I do indeed. And the trolley bus is under threat in various places, including my former residents of Belgrade, although it's had a bit of a reprieve in Belgrade. But, they've been disappearing left and right. But I'm glad to say that in Sarajevo, Bosnia's capital, a trolley bus is back running a line that it hasn't run for 33 years. And this is the line into Vogašća, which is a suburb of the city. And the line last ran 33 years ago. And, of course, what happened then was that the conflict in Bosnia kicked off. And the poles which support the wires for the trolley buses, the power wires for the trolley buses, were actually blown up at the start of that conflict. And it's taken 33 years to repair the network, but the trolley buses are back. There are brand new buses on there. And for anybody who hasn't ever ridden on a trolley bus, it's a very lovely way of getting about, and I highly recommend it.
Guy Delorney, thanks for that tip. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Let's finish now with another story about a delightful way of travelling. Because finally, as the overnight rail network opens up more and more here in Europe, a new service is being planned between Switzerland and Denmark. A night train between Basel and Denmark could be coming back to Copenhagen. Well, Noelle Salmi is a travel, culture and sustainability writer. She joins me now from Monocle Zurich studio. Good morning. Welcome back to Du Forstrasse 90, Noelle. How's Zurich looking this morning?
Well, Zurich is rainy now, so the cafe is buzzing inside, not outside as it was on Friday.
So let's all jump on a train to Denmark then. So tell us about the plans for this new train. It sounds absolutely delightful.
Well, it was just one of many trains planned, announced by SBB, Switzerland's national railway. And yes, it's going to be a seasonal service from Basel to Copenhagen, Denmark, and then later there will be an expansion from Malmo to Sweden. But it's only part, as I said, of the many offerings that will be coming up this year and next year, including a lot of new trains to Italy.
So just to give us a broader view of what this expansion involves. You mentioned Italy. We've also got Denmark.
Yeah, well, speaking of Denmark, I think that's an interesting one because SBB isn't planning too many night trains, but Scandinavians are really looking for a more eco-friendly way to travel. So that is tapping into that market. And in fact, the market for international travel by train in Europe has really expanded. One of the things the CEO of SBB said was that people are willing to travel now. When the calculation was 4 hours, it's now 5 or 6 hours of travel, where the train seems to be a much more appealing option to the plane. And so what's happening in Italy is that trains from Zurich to Bologna, that direct line will be expanded to Florence. The connection to Genoa will continue all the way down the coast to Livorno. Venice will be served twice as frequently. Already there are many more trains between Zurich and Munich, and so on.
And just explain to us the reaction from the Swiss, given the fact that they are incredibly proud of their own internal rail network. Is this now going to be embraced by train lovers in Switzerland?
That's a great question. And in fact, it is. I asked a lot of people yesterday, and everyone said, yes, I read that now we'll be able to take a train right into Südtirol. And people were really excited about it. Swiss love to travel by train. They're very proud of their train service. And in fact, I think it's fair to say that Swiss train service, while it's not nearly as fast as the AVE or the Frecciarossa, is the most reliable train service in Europe.
And can Switzerland still claim the crown for being the best rail service? You mentioned the fact that it's not super fast, but the reputation from the outside of Switzerland, at least, is that to get on a Swiss train is an absolute moment of joy.
And yes, it absolutely is for a lot of reasons. First of all, the landscape is beautiful. The reality is that, if you're traveling from abroad, the Zermatt to St. Moritz Glacier Express is 8 hours, but it's almost a must-do, or at least some portion of it, because the landscape is beautiful, the train is lovely. Also, Swiss trains have always been a symbol of engineering prowess. The Gotthard Tunnel, when it opened in 1882 at 15 kilometers, was the longest in the world. Now the Gotthard Tunnel the base tunnel is at 57 kilometers, still the longest in the world. The Jungfraujoch was the highest railway station in the world at 3,454 meters for over 100 years, until China opened one in Tibet. So you've got the engineering prowess, and more than that, it is absolutely reliable. The train comes at the same time at your station any time of the day, any day of the week, and that means that it will arrive and you'll have a short, easy connection wherever you're going.
Noel Salmi, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests, and thanks to our producers Carlotta Ribello and Laura Kramer. Our researcher was Francesca Jilks, and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday here in London. I hope you can join me that if you can. And The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great week.